A lot of us may suffer from gastroesophageal reflux disease or Gerd, also indigestion, heartburn. They're all sort of similar diagnoses, just called different things. So if you suffer from that, you probably feel some discomfort right where I'm pointing out, maybe even a little lower, somewhere you're very familiar with the path of your esophagus. So your esophagus is the tube that goes from your mouth down into your stomach. The interesting thing about the esophagus is that when we do have symptoms of an esophagus that is not able to move very well in its fascial sheath, or that it has some inflammation and irritation to, we tend to get left ear pain. We can get neck pain, shoulder pain, or musculoskeletal dysfunction in those areas, right? So certain motor patterns being affected, having increased tension, or altering our movement or motor control. The thing about tubes in the world of visceral manipulation is tubes love to be stretched. So this is actually one of the organs that is super simple to treat on yourself. And today I want to talk a little bit more about the anatomy, and understanding the anatomy. It's going to give us 3 more treatment options to do. So the anatomy, if we look at a cross section of the neck, there is like separate containers for the different things in our neck. The esophagus and our trachea, so our breathing apparatus, they're in a fascial sheath, and they are deep. They're right up against the front of the spine. This fascial sheath is continuous from the base of our skull all the way down through our thorax, connects in with the pericardium, and then connects into the diaphragm, which makes sense, right? Because that is also the length of the esophagus from our mouth to our stomach, which is below the diaphragm. Therefore, issues with the esophagus can also create cranial issues, because that sheath connects to the cranial base, so the bone at the bottom of your cranium. And so it has an influence on our function of cranial tensions and cranial nerves and central nervous system tensions. But then also understanding these connections at that point, at the base of the cranium, the layer, where the layer is in the neck, and then at the pericardium can be key spots that we do treatment. The first thing is, where can we palpate the esophagus in our neck? So the easiest way to palpate this esophagus is right next to the cricoid cartilage. So the cricoid cartilage is the cartilage ring beneath the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage is the part of our throat here that is like where the Adam's apple would be. So most of us can feel that on our own. And if you just feel that and then run your fingers down, you'll feel it sort of go in a little divot. And then there's another harder structure right below, and you can even feel the edges of it. That's the cricoid cartilage. So that cricoid cartilage, if you go to the side of it, you'll feel the roundness of it. And then right behind it, you can feel a little bit softer structure. Sometimes this is easier to feel laying down, but once you're on it, you can swallow and you'll feel it move under your hands. The reason that happens when you swallow, what you can feel is there's muscles around that tube, around that esophagus, that constrict and elevate the esophagus. You'll also feel how you're sort of right next to the sternomastoid muscles. The sternomastoid muscles are actually lie to the sides, but in front of the back of that fascial sheath. So the first thing that we're going to do, the first treatment we're going to do, is actually lift this visceral sheath away from the deep cervical fascia. The deep cervical fascia surrounds the spine and the erector spinae muscles. And so we'll do that lying on our back. And the reason we're doing that is we're just sort of, if you think of two fascial sheaths like this, we want to make sure that they're gliding on each other well, right? So we want to make sure that the fascia around the esophagus and the thorax is able to move before we want to stretch the tube within that fascial space. So the next space we'll also do treatment on is going to be up at the base of the cranium, working on the pharyngeal basilar fascia, or sometimes called the buccopharyngeal fascia. That's going to be on the sides of the spine and sort of deep to the muscles. So we're going to go through some muscles on that, but we're also going to do the treatment by tractioning the cranium superiorly toward that. And we'll do that lying down on the ground. And then the last treatment has to do with the anatomy of the esophagus when it comes into our chest. So the esophagus comes down through that tube, and it is veering a little bit to the right when it's up in the neck, but then it comes around, and at the area of the aorta of the heart, it curves, right? So the aorta is like a fulcrum where the esophagus goes around it. And then it goes towards the left as it descends to the stomach. So we're going to use the area of the aorta as another spot to direct our manual therapy. And the way you find that is your manubrium, which is the bone right below the notch of your sternum. You'll feel it sort of rise up and fall again as it turns into your sternum, that angle right there called the angle of Louis. You'll come just to the left of it, and you'll put your hand down and press in a little bit until you are aware of the pulse. Right there is your aorta. Right there, I have a hold of part of my esophagus. It's like I'm pinning down the aorta onto the esophagus even more. And then the next spot is going to be where your stomach comes in at the bottom of your diaphragm here. So these three spots, the stomach, that aorta, the cricoid cartilage, and the base of your skull, these are going to be important anatomy spots that we're going to use while we do self-treatment of the esophagus.